America's ledger now bleeds $36 trillion. China is submerged under $15 trillion. And Japan sinks beneath $10 trillion of debt. The UK adds $3 trillion to the total. France adds $3.5 trillion. And every major nation is now drowning in this inescapable ocean of red ink. This totals $317 trillion. 330% of the entire planet's gross domestic product. A mathematically impossible sum to repay. The entire world must work for 3 straight years without spending a single dollar to clear this debt. And this fact raises one forbidden question. If every single nation on the planet is a debtor, then who is the creditor holding $317 trillion in pure, unadulterated assets? Because debt is a closed loop. A perfect zero-sum game. For every single borrower, there has to be a lender. So if the United States owes $36 trillion, then some entity owns $36 trillion in direct claims on that nation, which means the entire global debt has an owner on the other side. Someone possesses $317 trillion in global assets, and their identity unmasks the largest wealth transfer machine ever built in all of human history. This is not happening with armies or conquest, but through a quiet, invisible system where the vast majority must borrow, and a tiny, powerful few always lend. In this system, interest compounds forever on debt that mathematically cannot be repaid, creating a permanent upward vacuum for the world's financial wealth. Now we reveal who holds that $317 trillion, and how the system is designed to create more debt than the money available to ever repay it. You are about to learn why this is an intentional, carefully engineered architecture of control, and not some kind of unfortunate, accidental economic crisis. We identify the specific institutions profiting from this cycle and why the entire system must fully collapse, but only after maximum value has been extracted. Realizing what is happening is not about learning classroom economics. It is about pulling back the velvet curtain to see the real machinery of global power. It is about seeing this global debt apparatus as the primary tool that funnels wealth upwards while making the whole process seem completely natural and inevitable. To identify the holders of this debt, you must first unlearn what you believe debt is. Because the modern system does not operate like a personal loan. You imagine borrowing $10,000 means the bank takes existing money out of its vault and then simply transfers that physical cash to you directly. Then you repay the loan and the bank gets its capital back with interest added on top. That entire popular assumption about banking is completely wrong. The incredible truth is that the money for government bonds does not exist before the borrowing. The very act of issuing the debt creates the money. Central banks purchase these government bonds by conjuring brand new digital money out of thin air, literally creating it with a few simple keyboard entries. The US government needs $1 trillion it does not have, so it issues bonds. The Fed announces it is buying $500 billion of them. Commercial banks absorb the other $500 billion. But where does the Fed find the cash to make this happen? It is the central question. The shocking answer is that it does not have the money. It is created from thin air, typed into existence on a keyboard in a single moment. The Fed's digital ledger magically swells by $500 billion in assets and liabilities. The big commercial banks then repeat this exact same process. 1 second ago, that money did not exist anywhere on Earth. Now, it floods the system, all born from a simple promise to buy a government bond. So when the government borrows $1 trillion, that entire amount is created brand new. But this is where the perfect trap begins to close in. You see, only the principal amount is ever brought into existence, never the interest. Imagine they borrow that $1 trillion at 5% interest. That means they must repay the $1 trillion plus $50 billion in interest each year. But only the original $1 trillion was ever made. That extra $50 billion must be found somewhere else in the economy. It is pulled from future debt or taxed from your existing money. This is not a mistake. It is a mathematical certainty. A closed loop. Total debt must always be greater than the money available to pay it back. The entire system demands ever-increasing mountains of new debt just to pay the interest on the old debt. This is not a flaw in the system. This is the system working exactly as designed. So who owns this unpayable debt? The creditors fall into 4 distinct and powerful groups. We have institutional investors, foreign powers, and the ultra-wealthy. But we start with the most powerful group of all the central banks. The Federal Reserve currently holds $5 trillion of U.S. government debt. The Bank of Japan holds another $5 trillion in Japanese debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion of European government bonds. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion of its own. across the entire globe. Central banks are now holding $25 trillion in government bonds. An absolutely staggering number to imagine. That is just 8% of the total $317 trillion in debt. But it is the bedrock that supports this entire fragile structure. This bedrock allows governments to spend far beyond what they collect in taxes. But it leads to the final question: who owns these banks? The Federal Reserve is not a government agency, as most people believe. It is a private entity owned by its own powerful member banks. The 12 regional Fed banks actually issue private stock to commercial members. Think J, P, Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citigroup. Wells Fargo pulls a 6% annual dividend from its Federal Reserve shares, while the Fed holds $5 trillion in government bonds. That interest income flows directly into the pockets of the private banks that secretly own the entire Federal Reserve System from the inside. The public is led to believe the Federal Reserve is a branch of the government. But this is a carefully constructed and complete illusion. It is a private banking cartel. Born in 1913, allowing a handful of banks to profit directly from the debt of the government. This model copies the Bank of England from 1694, a private company designed to lend money directly to the government for a war. Parliament authorizes this private company, which immediately loans $1.2 million to the government in a special arrangement. In exchange, it receives the sole right to issue the national currency. From day one, the entire model exists to profit private bankers. Today, the ownership structures are far more complex and hidden from view. But the underlying mechanism is absolutely identical every single time. Central banks create new money out of thin air, lend it to governments, and then collect all the interest which is paid for by the taxpayers. Now we examine the second category of ownership, which is institutional investors. This includes pension funds and giant insurance companies. It also includes mutual funds and sovereign wealth funds. These entities hold a staggering $120 trillion in global debt. Pension funds hold $50 trillion. Insurance companies hold $35 trillion. Mutual funds, 25. And sovereign wealth holds 10. But who truly owns these institutions? A pension fund is, on paper, owned by the workers whose retirement funds that it is supposed to manage. Yet the workers themselves have no control over the institution. The only people with control are the highly paid fund managers. And those fund managers are compensated based on the total assets under their management, not based on the actual results they get for you. Major insurance companies like MetLife and AIG are all publicly traded. But the ownership of those shares is incredibly concentrated. The top 10% of all households own 89% of all stocks and bonds, meaning the wealthy effectively own these companies. Mutual fund giants like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street now manage over $20 trillion in assets. Vanguard is owned by investors, but all the real control is with management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded, but their ownership is locked up by the wealthy. The unmistakable pattern across every single one of these powerful institutional investors is that true control is held by a tiny minority. The power rests with a tiny management class, and the real economic benefit flows directly to the wealthiest at the very top. Now we get to the third category, foreign governments, who are holding approximately $30 trillion in other countries' debt. For example, China is now holding $3.2 trillion in foreign assets, $850 billion of that in U.S. Treasury bonds alone. Japan currently holds $1.1 trillion in United States treasuries. But why would they even hold another nation's debt? It's because when China exports $500 billion more to America than it imports, China is paid $500 billion in U.S. dollars. China then takes those dollars and immediately buys United States Treasury bonds. In the short term, this system looks like a benefit. America is getting cheap goods, and China is financing the whole purchase by lending that exact same money right back to the United States. But who is really benefiting from holding these trillions? It is never the average Chinese worker. The government holds these bonds. Now for our fourth and final category, the extremely wealthy individuals and their secretive family offices that manage all this money. The top 1% on Earth holds around $40 trillion in assets, and the vast majority of it is held securely in bonds. That tiny 0.01%, about 500,000 families globally, holds $10 trillion of that wealth. These are the families you know: the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, and the Saudi royal family. When you control $10 billion in pure wealth, You buy government bonds, corporate bonds, assets that pay you interest safely. One single family with $10 billion in bonds earning just 4% gets $400 million a year in passive interest income. They do not work for it. They do not produce anything. They collect $400 million every single year from their borrowers. This is the very core of the system. The wealthy simply lend their money to everyone else and then collect the interest forever. That interest is paid directly from your taxes, from corporate profits, which are extracted from workers, and from your mortgage payments. The wealth is always flowing away from the many and going to the few through this debt system. So now let us add it all up. Central banks are holding $25 trillion. Institutional investors hold $120 trillion. Foreign governments hold $30 trillion, and the wealthy hold $40 trillion. That is $215 trillion accounted for, with just $12 trillion held by smaller investors, including corporate treasuries and middle-class savers with bond funds in their retirement plans. But even this is held disproportionately by the very wealthy because wealth itself is so concentrated. The bottom 50% of humanity holds almost zero financial assets. They hold debt. They owe money on mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and for their cars. They are the borrowers. The top 10% holds the financial assets. They are the lenders. So the lender is the wealthy, operating through the central banks and institutions they own. The entire debt system is a machine that transfers wealth from the poor to the rich. Now, I will show you how this mechanism operates through history. We are in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church is the primary lender, and monarchs borrow from it to finance their wars. By the year 1500, the Church owns 25% of all land in Europe. This land is acquired almost entirely through foreclosures on the debts that kings could not repay. Now it's the 1400s. The Medici family in Florence becomes the wealthiest in all of Europe. How? By lending money to kings, to popes, and to powerful merchants across the continent. The interest they receive from lending exceeds the profit from every other kind of business. They become so powerful they can install popes. But this is still just the beginning. In 1694, the Bank of England formalizes the entire debt for wealth system. King William III desperately needs $1.2 million to finance a new war. So Parliament authorizes a private bank that will lend the money directly to the government. In return, that bank receives interest paid by taxpayers and gets the exclusive right to issue money. This becomes the blueprint. A private institution with a monopoly on creating money lends to the government. Nathan Rothschild in London lays down the ultimate law of power and control. Who controls a nation's money supply controls the nation, and I control it all. By 1850, his family holds half of all government bonds in Europe. Their wealth from lending interest outstrips the treasuries of entire nations. Jump to early 1900s America. J.P. Morgan runs the exact same playbook. By 1912, Morgan's banks hold 25% of all American financial assets. Lenders amass fortunes from interest income, producing absolutely nothing of value. Meanwhile, borrowers work and produce, only to owe ever-increasing sums of money. But the system is designed so the debt is a trap with no possible escape. When money is created from debt, only the principal exists, never the interest. If total debt is 120 trillion, but only 100 trillion exists, repayment is impossible. The only path forward is borrowing new money just to pay interest on old money. This makes the total debt grow even larger, requiring yet more future borrowing. This is why global debt explodes from $40 trillion to $317 trillion. The debt must keep growing, because if it ever stops, the entire system implodes. There is no money to pay the interest, and the house of cards collapses. The Bank of England's founders in 1694 understood this perfectly. They knew the government could never repay them because the interest owed was designed to be too large. Perpetual debt creates perpetual interest payments, a permanent transfer of wealth. Now, let me show you exactly who is collecting that wealth in the modern economy. Global interest payments on $317 trillion in debt now cost $15 trillion. $15 trillion siphoned from borrowers to lenders in one single year. Governments pay their share through your taxes. The US government pays $900 billion on its $36 trillion national debt. That money comes from taxpayers. It is handed directly to the people who hold the bonds. Corporations pay their interest by extracting profit from the economy. They owe $90 trillion globally and pay $5 trillion in interest. So where does that $5 trillion come from? It comes from the gap between worker pay and consumer prices. Meanwhile, Households pay interest directly from their wages. Households now carry $60 trillion of debt, paying about $3 trillion in interest every year. A family making $70,000 a year can easily lose 29% of their income, sending it straight to creditors holding their debts. So, this $15 trillion river of cash flows upward from taxpayers, workers, and households into the hands of central banks, institutional investors, powerful foreign governments, and the world's most incredibly wealthy individuals who are waiting. The top 1% globally captures 40% of that $15 trillion in annual interest income. $6 trillion a year, but the concentration gets more intense. The top 0.1% captures $3 trillion for only 8 million people. Then the top 0.01%, just 800,000 people, captures 10% or $1.5 trillion. 800,000 people receive $1.5 trillion a year from a system where 8 billion people are paying for it. That is nearly $1.9 million per person in interest alone. This is not an accident. This is a wealth transfer mechanism. Debt operates as a financial funnel, pulling wealth from billions and concentrating it into the hands of just a few hundred families. And this entire process accelerates because the interest income itself begins to compound. If you get 10 million in interest, you simply use it to buy more bonds, which generate more interest, which you use to buy even more bonds in an endless cycle. Wealth explodes exponentially for creditors, while debtors are trapped paying forever. In 1850, the Rothschilds had 2 billion. 175 years of compound interest later, that family's fortune is estimated to be $1 trillion today. They don't build new companies for generations. They just lend money and collect the guaranteed interest on top of it. The first generation builds a fortune through actual business, but the perpetual family wealth is always maintained by becoming the lender. They simply own the bonds. They collect all the interest payments, and they reinvest it all, guaranteeing their wealth compounds forever. And that debt-based system must never be allowed to stop, because the moment it does, the entire global economy simply implodes. Governments require this debt just to function. Corporations require this debt for growth. Families require it for homes, cars, and education. The whole modern world is constructed on a mountain of debt, and debt always requires creditors, and the creditors are the wealthy. They use this inescapable machine to legally siphon wealth from everyone else through interest payments that will never, ever stop. But the entire system has a hard mathematical expiration date because this level of debt cannot possibly grow on forever. Global debt now expands at 7% a year. But global GDP only grows at 3%, hitting a breaking point by 2035. At 400% of GDP, the interest payments alone devour 40% of all global economic output. The model is officially broken. At that point, something has to give. Option 1, governments default, which vaporizes the bondholders and collapses the financial system. Option 2, governments inflate the currency, a hidden tax that transfers wealth and absolutely demolishes every single person's savings. The final option is a total debt jubilee, where all debts are suddenly wiped clean, forcing a chaotic restructuring of our entire society. All three of these scenarios completely annihilate middle-class wealth, while the global elite are protected by hard assets and foreign currencies. The middle class is left holding local currency, personal debt, and assets trapped in one place. And this is not an accident. This machine is engineered to funnel wealth to the top in boom times and in bad. During expansion, they just collect endless interest. But during a collapse, they use their cash to acquire every valuable asset for just pennies on the dollar. Like in the Great Depression, when banks seized all the family farms, wealthy investors swept in to buy the land, turning proud owners into desperate tenant workers. We see this exact same blueprint repeat in 2008 as millions of homeowners default, and firms like BlackRock move in for the kill. These private equity funds buy hundreds of thousands of homes for 50 cents on the dollar, crushing family ownership for corporate control. This is exactly what happens in the next crisis when the debt system breaks. The entire middle class holding all the debt begins to default. The wealthy, holding hard assets, step in to purchase all those defaulted assets at absolute fire sale prices. But this is not a crisis. It is a wealth extraction machine, precision engineered to transfer value from the many to the few during both good times and total collapse. And you cannot escape it because the entire system is global and totalizing. Your mortgage interest goes to a bank owned by wealthy shareholders. You pay taxes, which service government debt that is owned by bondholders who are, Again, the same disproportionately wealthy group of people. Every single economic transaction you make contains an invisible interest component that flows in only one direction, upward to the very top. The average American now pays $20,000 annually in these direct and indirect interest payments. A staggering amount of money over a lifetime. That becomes $1.4 million flowing from you to creditors who are 100 times wealthier than you are. The system's blueprint is simple: create money through debt, charge interest on that debt, and then collect on it from everyone. Perpetually, the true masterstroke is ensuring the debt is never repaid, so the interest never stops. The $317 trillion question is answered. The ultimate lender is a tiny global elite that operates through the central banks they command and the financial institutions they already own. They are the true creditors for the entire global population, managing vast direct holdings of the world's debt, making everyone their debtor. These interest payments from 8 billion people to the top few million is the single largest wealth transfer in all of recorded human history. It happens invisibly, embedded in every transaction.